All right, welcome to episode 4 of Yankeroos. I'm Junayd Mahmood, and I'm here with
Daniel Whiten, the other half of Yankeroos, the ruse part of Yankeroos BFC.
That's right, the shitster and the reasonable.
The calm voice in a storm.
That's
yes.
right, exactly. Calm voice of reason.
We'll see. I mean, what is this? Episode 4. So who knows?
When our powers combine, we are Yankeroos, and it's football to your face.
Where else would you want it?
We've got quite a bit to discuss. Some interesting events yesterday evening in the Premier League. Also, the other leagues are now up and running, and maybe not as interesting as you'd like, but still a lot to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we did chat about Jose Mourinho last week, and the topic of conversation was after a loss to Brighton, whether or not, and you know, a deserved loss, not like a surprise last minute kind of deal. The topic was whether or not his famous third season syndrome was going to continue, albeit this time without a league title, which generally speaking it happens after he's won 1 or 2 league titles, he falls out of favour.
That's right. We did win a Europa League.
Yeah, and a League Cup. You know, that's for most clubs that would be something they'd really remember, but for Manchester United, that's not the case. And 1 week later, they take on a real threat in Tottenham. Sorry about that, but they take on a real threat in Tottenham, and they've beaten comprehensively, at least on the scoreboard. If you and the press conference afterwards, this kind of deal. So that's it. We did speak about it previously, but I think it warrants further discussion.
For sure. Jose Mourinho, the gift that keeps on giving, right?
Absolutely. I mean, it's...
But I'm the special one. I have 3 Premier League titles, more than all the other Premier League managers combined.
Absolutely.
He was just waiting for Arsene Wenger to leave so he could pull that stat out.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it wouldn't have worked that well, last year perhaps. But, well, I mean, again, that whole thing about respect, please, I deserve respect. You need to respect me. And while on the other, there's Arsene Wenger was getting quite a bit of, from his own fans and from the media, quite a bit of criticism. So he probably could have had the same argument. But fortunately, he's a little bit more reserved.
Yeah, I mean, hey, look, I'm not the biggest Tottenham fan, as you know, but
Really?
I'm going to try and be even-handed for this. It never makes me particularly happy when Tottenham win, but in this case, there's a silver lining because I think Mourinho's a cunt. And I am not afraid to say that in public.
All right. That's going to get us some likes and some...
Talk about shit stirring. But I don't think that's particularly a particularly controversial point.
No, and I mean there are coaches who will endear themselves to players, and players will want to perform more for that coach because of the friendship and the companionship that they have, and that exists in every sport. And then there's coaches who will push someone further through criticism and through being an absolute shit, you know, that was the thing always with Jose Mourinho, and it was that that behavior was excused because of his success.
Right.
And if you're going to treat people like that, and you know, it comes into everything else as well. If you have, someone like that who's not really controllable, who will do that in front of sponsors, who will probably put a bit of a fear into incoming players and young players. He's never been good with young players. You know, that is all okay if you're winning in football, you know, whether that's good or bad or not. But when you're not winning, that attitude not only doesn't look very good for you, but it pushes you into the area of being this kind of tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist guy who people go to for a wacky quote.
And you can tell it's having a lot of effect on him personally. You know, the pressure that he is feeling and perceiving is just immense. I think this entire respect thing is pretty crazy. I mean, I didn't. You can't hear the reporters that well when they're asking questions, but from what it sounded like, there weren't that many there certainly wasn't anything that warranted or that constituted disrespect. And for him to just get up and walk out, usually like, getting up and walking out is I don't know, it's drastic enough in its own. But to walk out saying, respect, 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 as if you've been greatly disrespected just because some reporters had the temerity to ask you a few questions.
Sure.
I think, that the house is falling in on itself a bit.
Yeah, it certainly seems to be. And this this idea that the other thing that kind of came out of that press conference was that he said, well, you're never happy. I win and I win ugly, and you say that it's not an attractive game. And now we play an attractive game and we lose. Why can't you be satisfied? Which is really like, that's not, when you're criticizing a bunch of 1-0 wins taking you to a title, you're not saying that it would be better if we lost every game 3-0, but with a bunch of attacking flair. I mean, that's they're two different things. And I think that's what he came out, and he walked around afterwards and was waving to all the fans like he'd achieved something, and talked about how the fans were singing afterwards and were so happy, and it just really didn't seem like that happened in the broadcast that I saw. But this kind of stuff, it just seems like he's going further and further down this rabbit hole of paranoid ranting, and that never ends well for a coach. Never ends well for anyone, really.
But he's kind of made a career of it, and he's kind of the cat with 9 lives. Ever since he left Milan, I'd say, his track record has been declining. So with Madrid, you're expected to win the league. It's and he only won it once out of 3 years. And you're expected to win the Champions League. Look at how much success they've had in the past 5 years since he left. And so I would say that I would definitely rate his performance at Real Madrid as a strong underperform. I would say that he had a bit of a comeback with Chelsea. But the way that he alienated those players, I think that was something very new, and it signified a new chapter perhaps for him. I mean, for example, like when you see Zlatan's interviews about Mourinho and his time at Inter Milan, he said that that Mourinho turned him into an invincible warrior, just like in terms of his how much confidence he gave him, and how much he wanted to go out there and give everything for his manager. And Mourinho is an incredibly charismatic guy, and I think he's smart in creating this siege mentality. That everybody is doubting you, but I know your true qualities. Everybody is doubting us, but I believe in this team, and if we work together, we can get there. I mean, he's an incredibly charismatic individual, but to have the players turn on him the way that they did at Chelsea, and that entire mindset completely fall apart and backfire, I think that marked those were the first few chinks in his armor. And now, over the past 2 seasons at Manchester United, where he hasn't delivered, that pressure, I think, it's too much. I don't think that his way of dealing with players is necessarily fits these circumstances anymore.
I think that's definitely true. I mean, he's never had more than 4 years at a club, and that was the one time at Chelsea. And I don't think he's a guy that ever endears himself to players. So it's not. So there is a track record of that, but I do think that the creation of a siege mentality works when it's us against them, and that's how a lot of clubs get by. A lot of clubs in all different sports across the world will build this idea that what's the phrase, like, you hate us and we don't care, and that works if you're sticking together and it's you against the world and all this kind of stuff. But he hasn't been doing that. He has been saving some of the most savage kind of bile for his own players, and whether it's very passive aggressive stuff like criticizing Anthony Martial when he went to visit his new baby in the off season, in a very like, I don't know where he is. Maybe he's visiting his baby. I don't know where he is, which is like, it's like if you don't come to
very
Christmas
below the
and your
belt.
mother will, I thought you were going to be here, but you're not here. I look at your seat and it's empty. This kind of stuff. Like, my mum doesn't do that, but but it's just this kind of attitude, this like passive aggressive stuff, or he can be very pointed and just very much like this. Luke Shaw is too fat to play. This kind of stuff that. And I think that he's never been a guy that can come in and inspire people with his spirit and this kind of thing. But I do think that he has that ability to build individuals up and to make them into, I guess, us against the world kind of guys. But he hasn't been doing that lately. Another thing to mention on that Real Madrid point is last year, Manchester United, they finished, they win the FA Cup final. They finished second. It was a historic season from Man City. And that same Guardiola was coaching an historically good Barcelona at that time in Spain when he was with Real Madrid. So I do think that perhaps there's a realization there now that he's one of the best coaches of his generation, but he's not Guardiola. Again, he's been thwarted in his this time his second season and by the same man.
Right. I mean, I think that's a really interesting perspective. But I think that this is the first time Manchester United is the first club where he has so openly and personally criticized his players, because I think it's partially because he has veered away from this collective us versus them. Because you know what? Every manager in every league will criticize the referee. And that's a very convenient way to say, okay, well, it's not my players, it's not our fault. Even though inside the dressing room, you might have a very different tone. And maybe when you're speaking frankly and away from the cameras, you can be a bit more expressive and a bit more honest. But there's a reason that the managers do that. I mean, Wenger is famous for saying, "I didn't see it," and there's a reason. You want to protect the players, and when you're going to criticize them, even give them the blow dryer treatment, the way that Sir Alex Ferguson used to, and that's something that stays in the dressing room. I've been lucky to play various sports with various coaches with very different coaching styles, but there are definitely some coaches that really tear into you. I played American football when I was 13, 14 years old, and I had this one great coach who would just lose it on the field, just absolutely lose it. But then, like he would come up to you after training, he'd put his arm around you and be like, "Hey, I want to make sure you understand because I see something great in you, and you can, and you'll be amazing." And so, like when I would do something good or I would fix that mistake, he would stop practice and he would tell everybody, "Look at what Junayd did. Whatever he had for lunch, I'm having that too." And so, there's definitely a technique. You have to criticize, but I think doing it in front of the press corps, doing it so publicly, doing it, when you to the extent that you're bringing families, when you're commenting about them not only personally but publicly, I think Mourinho is not in a good place. I don't think he would do that at Milan. I don't think he would do that at Chelsea, where he was confident about his team's prospects for being successful.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing to say about that, and it's not directly sports related, but one of my favorite comedians, Norm Macdonald, said the thing with comics is that they live long enough to become a caricature of themselves, and so whatever has been their I guess their most successful or their kind of calling card in a way, whether it's doing wacky impressions or whether it's being obnoxious or whether it's being, the kind and sensitive person who says outrageous stuff and whatever your personality type is, then they rely on that and that becomes who they are. They become this caricature of themselves when in reality that was part of what brought them to where they were. And
And
perhaps
before it was intentional. It was like, I'm going to do this very intentionally because it'll yield results. But then you start buying into that.
yeah, and perhaps he's tricked himself into thinking that this kind of me against the world mentality is how I became who I am, and he obviously, thinks he's pretty special, which we've known for a long time. But at no point does he try even false modesty. And he deserves to be considered that way. But it just doesn't seem like, it seems like he's hasn't really got a period of self-reflection, hasn't really decided, you know what, maybe it wasn't a good idea to do some of this stuff. I mean, as well, he's up against the most competitive Premier League in a long time. No longer can the name and the money of Manchester United bring them the best players. And
Especially if you look at how some of those amazing players, like if you look at Paul Pogba at Juventus, how their careers have so dramatically tailed off. We spoke about this last week, so we won't talk too much about it. But for example, Paul Pogba, he was thought of as a contender within the next 5 years as for best player of the world for a Ballon d'Or. And he's a far cry from that now, despite his showing at the World Cup.
That's absolutely the case. And he showed at the World Cup how good he can be. Not that it's not a Mario Götze situation where he was really considered to be the next best thing in German football, and then he played under Guardiola, and since then has never been the same player. Who knows whether that was going to happen, or who knows whether it wouldn't. Sometimes that can happen with someone's confidence and that kind of thing. But it just seems like Paul Pogba's not being given the space and the treatment that he should be given at Manchester United. And when you bring in someone for 100 million, and which at that time was a record, you would think that you allow them to have a greater degree of control. It's the same now that Juventus is being kind of re-engineered to fit Ronaldo, which happened at Madrid over several years. Because if you're going to spend that much money, you don't just, keep
You
it as
don't
an
force
afterthought.
them to fit into your very strict interpretation of the game. Like if you look at Sanchez, this guy had something like 37 goals in his last season at Arsenal, and since he moved, I think he has 3 goals. Mourinho. The thing is, like, and this will play into our next topic, but Mourinho doesn't buy young players and give them freedom to express themselves. He
And he
buys
doesn't build up young
established players.
players. He doesn't give young guys a chance.
Right.
I mean, he doesn't. I mean, the purchase of Sanchez was a spite purchase. It was, I don't want him to go to Man City. That was the reason that they was bought. It was like a ego measuring purchase. I mean, and the Paul Pogba thing. He's buying players like when I play fantasy football, because I'm like, why not? I've got the money. I'll get a Pogba and give me a Lukaku.
Yeah.
This is this kind of thing of like, whereas Guardiola spent more money and Klopp spent almost as much money, but there seems to be more method to it. Whereas the process of regeneration, or whatever you want to call it, at Manchester United doesn't seem to have much method to it.
Exactly. But let's talk a little bit about the game, because for me, the game and the reaction to it are two very different topics. Just shortly, for me, I think that managers get too much shtick for what happens in those 90 minutes, because football is a crazy game. It's a question of luck. It's a question of nerves. It's a question of putting away your chances. And for me, Manchester United were the better side for the first half of the game, and they had they could have been 2, maybe even 3-0 up. That penalty appeal, which I think was a stonewall penalty that wasn't given. Maybe if everything had gone as it should, with Lukaku putting the ball into the back of that open goal, and that penalty been given, Man United probably go in 2-1 at the break. But football is a funny game, and Spurs took their chances. I think Moura scored with every goal, every shot he put on frame. Harry Kane, listen, I mean, I'm not a Tottenham fan, but this guy plays so simply and so effectively, and he's so intelligent. You'll never see Harry Kane doing a whole bunch of step overs and like trying to beat a man one on one, or trying to dribble through like 4 or 5 players. He just is really intelligent with his positioning. When he is about to challenge for a header, he knows where to place it, and he's got the skill to get it on target. And it's a very well drilled team. And unfortunately, yesterday was the day when Mourinho decided that he was going to play a bit more open, and I think that really upset the balance of his team, and they weren't prepared to play that way. Maybe he bowed to player pressure, that we're saying, okay, we're tired of playing this way. Give us a little bit of freedom to express ourselves. And maybe Mourinho, since he was in such a embattled position to begin with, folded, and this is what came out of it.
Yeah, I get the feeling if he did that, he would have got stuck into the players at the press conference. He would have said, "They want me to play this way, and now look what happens." I think he wouldn't have been able to bite his tongue in that sense. I think you're like completely right in the sense of it's strange to start that in week 3. I saw their win over Leicester in week 1, and that was very, from the moment that penalty went in after 5 minutes or whatever it was, you knew what the result was going to be. It seems strange to put it in at this point, but maybe he thought that's the best chance we have of beating Tottenham, that we have to be expansive and open. Mm-hmm. They're a top 6 team. Maybe that's what we need to do. But I do really, I do like the way that Klopp or Guardiola would have reacted in that sense. Like when Klopp took over, Brendan Rodgers had been winning 1-0 or 1-1 draws for the last year. And that happened for the first few months at Liverpool. And then there were games that he'd lost 3 or 4-0. And he's like, but this is, you see what we're getting at. We're building towards something. I find this game to be, the result aside, to be inspirational for what we're getting at. And that's something that Mourinho could have said. Mm-hmm. But it's also about being a little bit smarter about it, coming as opposed to bringing up this statistic about 3. You know what 3 is? 3-0. You know what 3? I won 3 Premier Leagues. Yeah, but you know what it is? It's round 3, and you've got 3 points. It's just like right. If you want to play that game. So it seems like, again, maybe there's method in the madness, and you never know. This guy is one of the best coaches of all time.
Yeah, but I think there's a reason why his longevity is so limited at every club he's been at, and I think that it's pretty authentic that he is losing control of the situation and that they're in a downward spiral, and so for me, I'm pretty confident he won't make it through the season.
Yeah, I would say so. I think a big thing was the lack of buying all of the players that he wanted. This kind of shopping list of players guys like Boateng, who just seemed like, I don't know that he's a really good fit. I don't know that he's still in form. He gets injured all the time. The fact that didn't happen, and the fact that other players that are quite good players but are out of favour, that could be sold, haven't been sold, suggests to me that they're kind of planning for life after Mourinho. I think Anthony Martial is an amazing player, and he was so sought after by big clubs. Juventus and Bayern were really interested in Martial. And the fact that he didn't go anywhere, even though he didn't really play much last year, I think suggests that they're planning for life after Mourinho. They don't want to get rid of all of their potential talents who are 22, 23 years old to play Mourinho ball if he leaves in 6 months' time.
Well, that's a good transition to our next topic. You want to set it up?
Yeah, so not by any means a surprising topic, and that's probably the main thrust of the topic. But if you can jump on line, I'm not going to give any shout outs to any other. Anyway, you need to get all your football news over here at Yankeroos FC. Let me tell you that.
That's right.
But if you were to go online, there are internet sites that have the tables of all of the European leagues, and it is funny that after 3 rounds in England, 2 rounds in Spain and Italy, and 1 round in Germany, you have the usual suspects on top. You got Real and Barca top 2. You got Dortmund, Bayern top 2. Juventus, Napoli top 2, and Paris is number 1 after 3 rounds in the French league. And it's, I guess it's just for coming from the perspective that we've come from, where we come from salary cap based leagues, where there is always competitiveness, and even though there are centres, your Boston Celtics or your LA Lakers who have advantages, that they're not always going to be on top. And I think it is something that it has historically been a thing in European football, but the amount of money that's in there now, this dominance hasn't been seen before. No one had ever won more than 3 Bundesligas in a row, and now Bayern have won 6. This is this kind of dominance now because they are so far ahead, because they've got so much more money, so many more advantages. I mean, at what point do people switch off?
I mean, you told me this interesting anecdote about the interest and excitement about the Bundesliga during the Klopp time at Dortmund. Do you want to tell that anecdote?
Yeah, so during the Klopp time, when it was really a 2-horse race in the Bundesliga, the demand for Bundesliga information rivaled that of the Premier League in the US. So
while you were working at AFP?
Working for AFP, they put more people on, they pursued doing live blogs of the Bundesliga, this kind of thing, all this kind of stuff that hadn't really existed in English at that point in time because of the demand. So from the US primarily, and also from India, we had a big demand for more information. And I've since that time that the Klopp's left and Bayern have really re-established their dominance, that interest has really waned and it's gone to the Premier League. And I'm sure that's not an isolated event in Italy or in Spain. I mean, it's been a duopoly for quite a while, but that is something that I think might not really hit home outside of Germany, because you've got full stadiums all over Germany. You've got teams in the second division with 40,000 seat stadiums that are full. That which gives it the impression that the league is doing fine. But I think in the sense of modern football, where you need to have an international footprint, and if you want to grow your footprint internationally, people want to back a winner. And not only that, they want to back a winner who competes against someone. So if I was living in the US, why would I become a Bayern fan if they win every year? Why would I become an Ajax fan in Holland unless I had some connection to?
Right. And have you seen, for example, blips in interest with, for example, Nagelsmann and Hoffenheim doing so well?
There's been some degree of people but Leipzig was the big thing. People were curious about Leipzig because they had the financial power not to really rival the big clubs, but where they didn't have to let go of any players. They weren't buying big names, and that's part of their policy. But they didn't need to let go of a 21-year-old player when somebody came with a big offer, and they could afford to preserve team harmony over that. So that was probably something that people were more interested in, and it got a bit of penetration where it otherwise wouldn't. But again, there is a waning interest there.
And it makes a ton of sense. If you're a global brand, like for example DHL, then what you want to do is you want to penetrate all around the world. It's not only about being in a regional market, which I think the Bundesliga still very much is. If you look at the sponsors of Bayern, it's Telekom, and so it's that's the German national telecommunications provider, which, to be fair, is also quite active in Central and Eastern Europe. But that's not something that's relevant to a Chinese fan or to an Australian fan. Also, the Dortmund Evonik, which is a chemical company, German chemical company. And so, these guys I think the Bayern's success has definitely created a situation where the Bundesliga is not as enticing to non-German fans. I mean, and maybe you could say there are some sour grapes in the Premier League amongst English football fans that, their clubs pay less attention to them now because they're not as relevant, they're not as important. The people who come in and buy a season ticket and we'll go for a couple of pints at halftime, to buy from the food service. Like it's not as relevant from a revenue perspective. And to be honest, people are going to tune in around the world no matter if, your nose is out of joint because, I don't know, maybe Arsenal didn't have a, annual supporters meeting this year or something. So it definitely has some good things and some bad things. I love the fact that the Bundesliga has the 50+1 rule, where the 51% of the club has to be owned by members of the fans. Um, but you're right. I think it's something that makes these leagues, like the Bundesliga, like Serie A, very predictable and less interesting to watch, less interesting to follow.
Yeah, and then that will flow through to the Champions League. You won't have a team that will be able to build up a degree of stability that they could challenge for the Champions League. I mean, you've seen Atletico Madrid do it kind of remarkably well, but other than that, there hasn't been a team in mainland Europe that has realistically challenged for quite a while. You had Monaco do it for 1 year. They played a semi-final and they were picked apart by wealthy clubs from all over. And I think that's something that in the long term probably will harm supporter interest, even if supporter interest has been sustained through, like we mentioned before, my housemate, shout out to Philip. Philip is a big Frankfurt fan, but doesn't mind Bayern's dominance because he thinks it's good for the Champions League and he wants to see a German club win, and he knows Frankfurt aren't going to win the Champions League, which is one of those things that is kind of a little counterintuitive, but that's what Bayern at some point are basing their support on. They always have the spine of the German national team, and they rely on the fact that when they make it to the semi-finals of the Champions League, I mean, they're not going to be... very few German fans will cheer against them.
Mm-hmm.
So, again, who knows? It is only week 2 in most of the leagues, week 3 in the Premier League. It could change. We could have... it was only 2 years ago that Leicester did what they did, but it is something that I think harms the league, and it is something that again plays into the hands of the Premier League, where realistically there's 6, maybe 5 clubs that could win each year.
Let's not discuss who the 5 versus 6 are. I'm not feeling too optimistic about Arsenal this season, but let's see. Emery is a Europa League specialist, and so that's a nice backdoor into the Champions League.
Absolutely.
But that's a great transition into our next topic, which is why are young players leaving the youth setups of English Premier League teams at such an astonishing rate? You've had Jadon Sancho leave, a very high-profile transfer. I think he was 17 or 18 when he left Manchester City for Dortmund, and has been very successful. And he's only one of a handful. RB Leipzig are trying to buy Ademola Lookman, who plays for Everton. Although he is getting more and more established in the Everton first team. You have Reece Oxford, who is wanted by Gladbach, and spent some time on loan there. And I think that's very much a function of the fact that a manager in the Premier League can be sacked after 3 or 4 games, a bad run of 3 or 4 games. And look, I think with increased attention, that's happening to some extent every major league. But in the Premier League, teams are really willing to back their manager and invest to the extent that they expect results week in, week out. And with that kind of buying power, you can go out there to pretty much any other league, any other top league, and buy their top players. It's crazy to see Fulham, a newly promoted team, go out there and buy Andre Schürrle, or to buy John Michel Seri, who was one of the top performers for Nice in the past couple seasons. And so I think that young players see that. And they say, okay, well, maybe I'm the best of the crop here, but if the manager is not willing to take a gamble and let me express myself and to grow as part of the team, get some first team action, then maybe I'll go somewhere where I can get that.
Yeah, I think it's a really good thing for English football, in the sense that English players never left. They just never left England. They wouldn't go, and there's a very English-centric mentality. I mean, in several ways, but particularly seen in football.
You can count them on one hand. Like maybe Gary Lineker.
Yeah, that have been successful.
Paul Gascoigne, Glenn Hoddle, but usually later in their careers.
Usually later in their careers, and you've had a couple go to. I mean, Beckham and whoever else, that bloke from Liverpool, his name...
Michael Owens.
His name escapes me right now, but very Liverpudlian dude who played for Real for a while. But I think that...
Jonathan Woodgate? Steve McManaman.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there we go, Stevie. But I think it is ultimately a good thing for these guys that they are taking the chance to do it. That they don't. I remember the story of, I think it was about 5 years ago, when they were discussing Jack Wilshere going out on a loan from Arsenal, and he said, "Well, your two main options are either Rome or Bournemouth." And he said, "Oh, can I drive to Rome? How far is it from my house?" And,
He said that.
Yeah, and he didn't realize that. He did, of course. If someone had said it's Rome, Italy, maybe they said Roma, and he thought, "Oh, Rome is some second division team." It's just like a silly quote, and of course, it's fun to make fun of that, but it's. But it shows a bit of the mentality, I suppose.
I think this puts the Özil Erdogan picture in perspective. This is what we're dealing with footballers.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. They're not supposed to be. We don't look to them for, I guess, their intellectual or their geography knowledge. But the Ousmane Dembele thing, I think, is a really good example of what can happen with a young player who he was sought after from Rennes in France, and he was seen to be as a really great next talent, but he was offered by Bayern, he was offered a contract at Barcelona and at Dortmund. And at Dortmund said, "Well, you're going to play in our first team." And that was the reason that he went there. And that was something that Jadon Sancho cited when he decided to go to Dortmund, and they asked him why. And a lot of other players, I mean, Pulisic is a great example. You've got Alexander Isak from Sweden, and Alex Zagadou. He's got three names, and I'm forgetting one of them because I'm an expert. But who went from PSG to Dortmund for pretty much the same reasons, 19-year-old guy. And when you can have... It benefits a lot of these, I guess, mid-level clubs. So if you go to a club like Dortmund, you've got a lot of exposure. You can still attract sponsorship and this kind of thing. But at the same time, you're going to get a first-team slot. And whilst I'm not sure that that's a long-term great idea for Dortmund, if these players continue to leave after 1 or 2 years and you can't build that stability, I think that it shows that they are willing to really focus on their football and think about in the long term. What it means for the Premier League, I don't know. It's something that you...
But maybe that's a model, and it seems to be a very successful model for Dortmund, to take these players who have the option to go to a top club, to go to a Barcelona or to a Bayern, and say, "Hey, you're going to play. We'll make room in our squad for you, and we promise you like a certain minimum number of games." And obviously, the player has to be well advised, right? By an agent who's thinking long term, by friends and family who have their heads on straight, who will say, "Hey, maybe going to the top level, for example, like Nuri Sahin, who just went to Real Madrid and just sat on the bench. They have so many flops. Martin Odegaard, like this like Danish kid, or I don't know, like a Scandinavian kid, like who is a sensation, like a YouTube sensation when he was 16, and starting for his first team, and you just haven't heard about him. And so I think it makes a lot of sense. And for Dortmund to be able to sell, Dembele for the amount that they did, I mean, it seems like it turned out exactly the way that Dembele wanted it to, and it turned out very well for Dortmund as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it shows the maturity of Christian Pulisic that he's not doing the same thing. I think he really wants to stay in the system and become a really, really top quality player before he would move anywhere else. One thing I would say with the Premier League, again, you're not going to like it, but the example of Tottenham has been they've got a lot of English players, which isn't so common for a top six club. Their core really is based around some top young English players, and they put some time into them. They built that team together, and their victory over the summer wasn't signing a new player, but it was managing to keep these people together. So there is a definite lesson there for clubs that might want to rebuild. I
think now you're just taking the piss.
Someone like an Arsenal, for example, that might want to rebuild. And you can base. There's so much talent in English football, so you can base your model around that. So I don't. I think it's
Maybe we
definitely
could
still
talk very
possible.
quickly about Tottenham's prospects. Actually,
Yeah,
let's
yeah,
leave that for a different one.
yeah. Let's leave it for a different one because, well, I can see you.
Yeah,
you
no. I mean, maybe we cut this out and we'll put this in the outtakes, but I think that they've got a great squad in terms of their starting 11. But there's big questions as soon as you start scraping underneath that. They don't have a very deep squad, and they didn't strengthen in the summer transfer market at all. And I think you need 25 solid players that you can rely on to get you through the season, because they're in the Champions League as well, you know. And so to compete on all fronts until December, January, it's going to be tough. But you know what? You know, credit where credit is due. I think Tottenham are a very well run club. They're investing in the right places. They're very sustainable. They develop a lot of talent, and they're definitely one of the success stories of the last decade in European football.
Yeah, if your big rival is going to compete with you for the first time in a long time, the way for it to happen that you would find it tolerable, or theoretically, is if they were to invest in young players, if they were to play an attractive kind of football, if they were to not be a newly taken over club, for example, and they've done it in quite a good way. They are playing the Champions League when Chelsea and Arsenal are not, so who knows how that would go long term in terms of struggling with their depth. But I think that they've done it quite well, and I think it does bode well for clubs who might not have the resources of a Manchester United or a Manchester City, but who have the ability to take a risk and to see and to stick out with a coach. I think Pochettino is now the third longest serving coach in the Premier League, which is only 4 years, but that's a long time in the modern Premier League. So I think it's a credit to the club and the patience of the club. They've still not won anything, so that will be the big test.
That is a really big asterisk. By the way, still haven't won anything. All right, well, it makes it much easier for me to admit that they're a well-run club. Once they start winning things, maybe you'll hear the plaudits dry up.
If
Right. Well, maybe we can go back to this topic very quickly about the youngsters. Was there anybody on the move? Is there anybody in the sights of German clubs?
not that I for this particular transfer window, but I do think that the Jadon Sancho move has really created the idea in people's heads. Younger players, they think, I can go there. He just put out a video a couple of months ago of him buying some new fancy car, and I was talking about how he could drive it around in Germany, and I don't know, I might be misquoting here, but he could drive it a little younger than he could in the UK. And so you can still live the lifestyle perhaps you would otherwise want to. He's playing first team football. He'll be playing Champions League. That was never going to happen in the junior divisions at Manchester City. So, and the choice to players is one of three things. You can stay and hope that you are promoted into a club which would be one of the biggest in the world. You can move to another English club on loan or for permanently and see where that would lead you, or an option which has never previously been considered, which was to go overseas and play for clubs that will play the Champions League, that have a huge profile that you can still capitalise and make money, and which have good training and junior systems, so you will be given the opportunities and will be taken through well. So I think it's only going to continue. Right now there's apparently 6 young English players in the Bundesliga. Bundesliga 1, Bundesliga 2.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's only going to continue.
But I think looking at the English players is definitely one element of it. But I think just looking at more broadly, like for example, it's not as prevalent. But I think that you have players of all nationalities who are in the youth setups of very successful, wealthy English teams, regardless of their nationality, will, be much more open-minded about what to do when they get to that first team age, 18, 19, 20, rather than like before, let's say maybe 5, 10 years ago, all these young players just idolized the players in their first team, and the only thing they wanted to do was to wear that shirt out, on a first team match day. But now they're much more intelligent about it, and you can definitely see this pathway developing. Okay, well, instead of just butting my head against the wall here, where there are so many fantastic players ahead of me, I'm going to think about my career, and I'm going to take this route through, maybe through Germany or through some, mid-table team, and then come back, and then have a chance to play for Madrid or Barcelona or one of the top English teams. And so, in a way, it's much more heartening to think that players are being much more intelligent about their careers. But I think there's also something sad about it. The homegrown player who breaks through into the first team. For example, Jack Wilshere, when he left, it was something that was really sentimental, really emotional for Arsenal fans. But it was also a huge point of pride that he broke through to the first team and did so well, playing day in, day out when he's only 19 years old. I mean, that's a point of pride. That's something that you feel a connection to as a fan. That this player is steeped in the values, and has a strong emotional connection to the club, and that's something that's really, I think, is important to fans. Because you don't want a bunch of mercenaries on the field for you whose head will be turned by the next big club that comes around.
Yeah, it's a very romantic aspect, and I do like that. I do like when you have a picture of Steven Gerrard in a Liverpool jersey at 6 years old. I think that's something that, because clubs are so much more than just a franchise and that kind of thing. But that's up to the Premier League to decide if they want to prioritise that, if they want to integrate academies much more into the first teams, if they want to discourage buying older players. I mean, that's something that's within their power, with the ultimate result being a better national team, which I think the FA would definitely want. But they're also a huge money-making machine, and they might also be concerned that if they were to put rules in like that, that would make investors more interested in Spain or Italy or somewhere else. So
but I don't think Manchester City would all of a sudden abandon the club because of that. Maybe they have some more constraints to work with, but I think that makes it interesting, and it makes the project more interesting. And ultimately, it's much better for the vibrancy of the league, and it would definitely go a long way to making the fans happier and retaining that connection with the fans that they're losing. So I think it's a bigger topic, and it's something that maybe warrants a look. One thing I wanted to say, we talked a little bit about the Premier League and the pressure on the managers match day to match day. And it's a little bit like Football Manager. It's a little bit like one of these video games where it's like, okay, well, you think very much on the day of which tactics and which particular player's strengths would be best, to make sure that you prevail and live to fight another day. Whereas other teams, maybe they're not used to as much success, and so the pressure is lower. And so not only can they bring up player talent from the younger divisions, but can also, for example, like Hoffenheim, Nagelsmann came up through the ranks in their coaching setup, and they gave him time to experiment with his ideas. And now there's talk of Reiss Nelson, the Arsenal first teamer, who just broke out into the first team, going to play. He only has 12 months left on his contract, and there's talk of him going to Hoffenheim to play for Nagelsmann. Because they'll give them time, they'll give them playing time, and they'll try and develop them as players. Is that their heads are on a little bit differently from the Premier League.
Yeah, I think they're more patient, and they don't lose sight of the bigger picture in that sense. The biggest, the fun fact, I suppose, about the whole the short-term focus of the Premier League is that no English manager has ever won it, and it's. That's a kind
British managers have won it, but no English manager.
That's right, and I think that shows you that instead of giving someone time and really allowing them to develop, it's easier to bring in someone who's won the last few titles somewhere on the continent. And you can't blame clubs for doing that, really. You know, they bringing in someone who's been successful, who has Champions League experience, who has won titles, has to be attractive compared to giving somebody a shot who hasn't before. But it's to the detriment of ultimately, of course, English coaches, but ultimately the league as a whole.
Okay, so to wrap up, let's do something fun.
I love fun.
Kind of cynical, but who do you think will be the first manager to be sacked in the Premier League this season?
Whether or not it's sacked or walk away, I think it could be Mourinho.
Okay.
Yeah, I can't think of anyone else that. A lot of the clubs who, the promoted clubs have spent quite a lot of money, and I think they'll be given a fair bit of their managers will be given a fair bit of time. I think other clubs like West Ham are going through a pretty significant regeneration, so I think they're not going to sack their coach anytime soon. Perhaps the coach of Southampton, who's Mark Hughes. Perhaps he is the other possibility, because Southampton are a club who, for the last 10 years, with their junior systems, and even though they've been selling players, they've been sitting around about 7th or 8th. That seems to be the natural kind of place for Southampton, and they only just escaped relegation last year, and they're looking pretty bad this year. I think they all fancy themselves as more than relegation battlers. So if he doesn't turn it around, I think they could move him on sooner rather than later. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, they're a pragmatic club who seems pretty forward-thinking. I don't think they're going to go and get Sam Allardyce when they got rid of Mark Hughes. So
maybe Tony Pulis.
Yeah, I mean, this coaching merry-go-round, who will be next? But they tend to go with pretty good coaches, again, from Europe. Who knows? But I think Southampton's an outside chance.
I think I would say one of these clubs that has really invested a ton, because the pressure is so high now from their investors, from their boards, from their owners. So my money's on Fulham or on Everton, because they've really made huge outlays. Everton, they bought Richarlison for something crazy, £50 million, for a player who didn't really score that much last season. So as a forward, don't know, kind of unproven. And I think they spent pretty heavily on a couple other players as well. And Fulham, like when you get players that good, you get your Charles, you get your Everton brought in Yerry Mina from Barcelona, and they brought in another, was it Andre Gomez as well? I don't know, but they spent a ton. But Fulham also spent a ton. I don't remember exactly who the manager is, but maybe they want to upgrade at some point, and all they need is a couple of defeats in a row to give them a good excuse to let the manager go.
Yeah, I mean the whoever's sitting around about relegation in the relegation spots around about December is a huge chance to get sacked, just because of the consequences of going down. So we'll see about that at that point. But I do think that the wealth of the Premier League has allowed these newly promoted clubs power that they've never had before. I mean, Wolves, drew with Man City at the weekend and deserved to, and played well against a team that's perhaps the most favoured team in all of Europe. So I think that they'll be given a bit more of a chance. But again, I guarantee a coach will be sacked by the end of the year.
I think that's a pretty safe wager. We always like to end on a high note here at Yankeroos. So the topic we're ending with is who's going to get sacked.
My conclusion was somebody will. Somebody will get sacked.
Well, good. Daniel, thank you. And Daniel White and everybody. And
Junayd, everybody.
And I'm Junayd Mahmood, and we are Yankeroos, and we will see you next week. Thanks for watching.